Ecuador. We've talked a lot about El Salvador, which went from being the most dangerous country in the world to being the safest country in the Western Hemisphere because Nayib Bukele became the leader of El Salvador and arrested all the criminals and was just recently reelected with 85% of the vote because it turns out people like it when you arrest all the criminals. Well, Ecuador has been facing a similar problem. Over the past 2-3 months now, a major gang leader escaped from prison. This would be Jose Adolfo Macias Villamar. He's the leader of Los Choneros. He escaped from prison in Guayaquil. I'm sure I'm butchering all of these names. This was the day of his scheduled transfer to a maximum security prison, and that was on January 7th. At that point, crime goes through the roof. There was actually, you probably saw this clip, a group of criminals who busted into a TV studio while they were live on air and held the anchor hostage and the producers hostage at gunpoint. So you can see, you still got the TV host speaking into the camera, and these masked gunmen bust in. One has looks like a shotgun, pistols, people down on the ground. Bad looking stuff. Really, really bad looking stuff. So, after this happens, Ecuador President Daniel Noboa effectively declares martial law. They're calling this the Noboa Way. He changed the gang's designations from being mere criminal targets to being military targets. He unleashed the hounds, not quite as aggressively as Bukele in El Salvador, but it was pretty tough. And guess what happened? You're not going to believe this. The crime went down. Noboa had begun his crackdown on the gangs in December, and from December to January, so this is before the real acceleration, the number of killings in Guayaquil, or however it is pronounced, dropped by 33%. He then ramped this up even further, jailed hundreds of suspected gang leaders, reestablished control of the prisons, which had been taken over by the gangs, and some other institutions. He started just stopping fighting-aged men in the street, searching them for drugs, searching them for weapons. When they were bad guys, he would arrest them, throw them in the can. And guess what his approval rating is right now? 76%. Not quite as high as Bukele's. Bukele, who rounded these people up like animals, this satanic gang, MS-13, put them in cages, made a big display, humiliated them before the entire world. And guess what? El Salvador is much safer now. But Noboa is pretty close, and his approval rating is going up in direct proportion to how close to Bukele's policy he's getting. All of which is to say, not only that it turns out that when you lock up the criminals, the crime decreases, all of which is to say, if Ecuador can do it, why can't we do it? We have crime skyrocketing too. New York is much less safe today than it was 10 years ago. San Francisco, much less safe today than it was 10 years ago. Philadelphia, cities all over this country, LA even. If Ecuador can do it, if El Salvador can do it, why can't we? And the answer is we can. We could do that in 2 seconds. It doesn't take a Bukele. This is the proof. If Bukele were a one-off leader, he's very talented, but if he were the only guy in the world who can do this, then they wouldn't be doing it in Ecuador too. But they are. And actually, let's move out of Latin America for a second. How about in Hungary? Hungary's done a great job turning its country around. If Hungary can do it, why can't the United States do it? The former Dutch Prime Minister, Dries van Acht, this is a day of mispronouncing names. This is a day of very difficult to pronounce foreign names, so please forgive me. The former Dutch Prime Minister, Dries van Acht, and his wife just killed themselves together, legally, because the Netherlands has perhaps the most barbaric pro-suicide policy of any nation on earth. Canada is quickly getting close. Belgium is getting close, but the Netherlands has been on this track for a while. The Netherlands, there's a famous story that came out of a woman, elderly woman, who had agreed to assisted suicide on a sunny day, and then when the time actually came, she said, "No, I don't want to kill myself," and her family and the doctors held her down and poisoned her until she died. So this is spreading. So the Dutch Prime Minister and his wife decided to do this, and according to the Rights Forum, talk about an Orwellian term. This is a pro-suicide group. His health became more and more fragile, and he wanted to focus his attention on his wife, children, and grandchildren. But they decided to kill themselves together because they felt that they couldn't live without each other. So hold on, he wanted to focus more attention on his wife, children, and grandchildren. But then he realized he was not feeling that great. So he decided to kill himself and not focus any time on his wife, children, and grandchildren. And his wife felt so sad about this that he led her to kill herself as well. Does this remind you of anything that maybe you read about in school? Because this reminds me of something that I read about in school. Did you ever read about the old Indian practice of sati? The practice of a widow throwing herself on the funeral pyre of her husband as he's burning. And so she would obviously be burned to death as well. It's an old practice, those old Hindus in India. And the British put an end to sati. The British, when they colonized India and brought Christianity. Christianity first arrived in India with St. Thomas, the apostle, but they brought a little bit more widespread Christianity, and they put an end to that particular practice. Now that practice is coming back. This is just modern day sati. You know, suicide risk is increased over 2.5 times in families with a history of completed suicide. If you are related to someone who has killed himself, you are 2.5 times as likely to kill yourself, because suicide is scandalous. It's a stumbling block. It can lead you astray. That's what happened here. This woman wouldn't have killed herself if her husband didn't kill himself, but he did, so she's going to kill herself. And now the kids are going to see that and say, well, I guess that's just how we go these days, and maybe they're going to kill themselves. They're much more likely to. Maybe the grandkids will too. This is modern day sati. We are already seeing the social consequences of legalizing and encouraging suicide. And the question that it's going to come down to is not, is the West going to be, traditionally Christian and uphold all the moral prohibitions on all these sorts of things, like, murdering babies and having weird occult orgies and, ritual suicide? Are we going to continue those Christian prohibitions on those sorts of things? Or are we going to be really rational and intellectual and scientific? That's not the distinction. All those things I just mentioned that are supposedly rational and scientific and modern, they're just old pagan things. Infanticide, that's just an old pagan thing. Weird occult orgies, that's just an old pagan thing. That's what they used to do in the weird old ancient Greek temples and all the ancient temples to pagan demons. So ritual suicide, sati, they're just pagan things. So the question for us is, because everyone's got to serve somebody, is the West going to be Christian, or are we going to go back to being pagan after having been Christian, which is a kind of apostasy, which is much, much worse than the kind of paganism that exists before you see the revealed truth of religion. Much, much worse. Because you've seen the truth and you've rejected it, rather than just following nature. You've seen something beyond nature. And as a result of that, you've had the most flourishing civilization that has ever existed. Nothing like it will ever exist again. And then you go back. Okay, well, I would prefer the society without infanticide and weird occult orgies and the ritual suicide of your wife. I don't know. That's just me. That was a good clip, huh? Come on. Just between us girls, well, then you got to ring the bell and subscribe to the Michael Knowles YouTube channel, and then you'll get every other clip ever. See you next time.